All right, everyone. So we missed Monday's class, January 26th, and as a consequence, I wanted to do at least one of the lectures that I typically do as an asynchronous, just posted online, so that you have access to that information, but that we don't miss too much class. And what I've chosen to do is to do a lecture that I normally do on advanced neuron review, to do that asynchronously, because this is always a really awkward lecture. I actually really don't love doing it in person, because it doesn't quite fit into what we've been talking about in terms of pharmacokinetics, but it also is important for pharmacodynamics, but it's not actually pharmacodynamics. And so it's always sort of awkward. Also, it's information that I think many of you already know, and so it's always feels a little bit repetitive. So I'm going to do this as the online async and post it up there. You will be responsible for it, so I encourage you to watch it to the level that you need to watch it, to ask me questions. And you will find this information under the pharmacodynamic Prezi. So if you're trying to follow along with it, or if you want to look at the images, it is under the Prezi called pharmacodynamics. And so I'm going to advance here. There is a little bubble called advanced neuron review. The rest of this, what pharmacodynamics is, we will talk about that in person or online or in person, wherever it falls in terms of when we meet. So we'll come back to this big bubble here, but I just want to zoom into this advanced neuron review. And again, I think it makes sense to do this online async because a lot of these concepts are concepts that many of you already know. Again, if you're a biomed major or if you are a neuroscience minor, you've taken these classes, this is going to be review for you. So that means that you can come up, you can watch it to the level that you need to watch it, etc. But I also know that some of the things that I talk about here are not covered in some of our other biological psychology classes. So if you have only had biopsych, even with me, I don't cover some of these things. Or if you have had sensation perception or cogneuro, these may be new concepts to you. And so I do want to give you a chance to learn them and come up to speed on these concepts. So the first thing that I'll talk about is I'll talk about neurotransmitter systems. And I'm going to do this in blocks so that you don't have just one big long video to watch. And with neurotransmitter systems, this is really important to have a good basis of because so much of what we talk about with psychopharmacology is based on knowledge about neurotransmitters. And so this first slide is a slide showing how we classify neurotransmitters. And I will not ask you this explicitly on a test. So I don't need you to know that glutamate is an amino acid or GABA is an amino acid. What I'm trying to do is just show you that we do tend to classify these, and that can be helpful if you start to learn this. So for example, we talk about monoamine oxidase inhibitors, right? That is something that inhibits an enzyme that will metabolize monoamines. And so it's helpful if when I say monoamine, you're like, oh, well, that means dopamine or that means serotonin, right? Because those are two classic monoamines. So the key amino acids that we're going to talk about, and this is just about how the chemical composition of these neurotransmitters, the key amino acids we'll talk about are glutamate and GABA. Monoamines include dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Dopamine especially will be important. Acetylcholine is its own neurotransmitter. And then we have some unconventional neurotransmitters. So these are not the classic ones that we synthesize in the way that we tend to think about. We will certainly talk about endocannabinoids, right? When we talk about the cannabinoid system and we talk about THC. And then we have these large molecule neurotransmitters. And so the big thing there that we'll think about are opioids. We often think about opioids as external drugs that we take, but opioids are also things that we make, right, internally, endogenously. And so those are also considered neurotransmitters. So again, this slide, I don't need you to know in depth. I'm not going to ask you anything explicitly. What I do want you to know about neurotransmitter systems is I want you to remember that neurotransmitters, right, we tend to use the term excitatory or inhibitory, but neurotransmitters themselves are not necessarily excitatory or inhibitory. It's often about the receptor that they are interacting with. So this is just a list of key neurotransmitter systems that we'll talk about this semester: acetylcholine, cannabinoids, dopamine, GABA, glutamate, opioids, and serotonin. And I listed just their basic function. Every neurotransmitter has multiple functions. And so it's really hard to say, like, here is exactly what this neurotransmitter does because it will do so many things. But these are the things, right, that like you should get the sense of when we're talking about a neurotransmitter. And the biggest thing is that some of these neurotransmitters primarily create excitation. So, for example, acetylcholine, usually when we think about it in the context of neuromuscular function or learning and memory, it creates excitation, right? It leads to EPSPs that will make it more likely for a postsynaptic cell to fire. One of the biggest excitatory neurotransmitters that we will talk about is glutamate. Glutamate is it's the most pervasive excitatory neurotransmitter that there is. There are other neurotransmitters that are primarily inhibitory. So when we talk about cannabinoids, when we talk about opioids, both of those are inhibitory and tend to depress the system. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It is the most pervasive in terms of creating inhibition. And then there are some neurotransmitters that it really depends on the receptor that they are binding to, right? So this is where it's sort of a misnomer to talk about a neurotransmitter being excitatory or inhibitory. Dopamine is like that. There are 5 different dopamine receptors. And so depending on which receptor dopamine binds to, determines whether it's going to create EPSPs or IPSPs, right? Whether it's going to create excitation or inhibition. And serotonin, a lot of people assume is excitatory primarily. It's actually, if you think about serotonin's role, it is primarily inhibitory. In most contexts, it actually creates inhibition. But there are times when it binds to serotonin receptors because, again, there are different types of serotonin receptors. So there are times it binds to receptors where it creates excitation. So this slide is just to get you away from this idea that we have excitatory or inhibitory neurotransmitters, and brings you to this idea that we really have to think about which neurotransmitter is binding to which receptor type. And usually in class, what I encourage you to do is to think about, right, like clearly excitation is important, but we also want to know, why is inhibition important, right? Why is it necessary to inhibit neural function? And this will become clear as we start to talk about things, but I just encourage you to think about, what happens if you have continuous glutamate action, continuous excitation without the corresponding inhibition. All right, you're going to be all go, 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 and no stop. That is seizure activities. That might be heightened anxiety. So a really important concept for this class is always thinking about the body's need to balance an excitatory state with an inhibitory state. And that will come up again and again and again because drugs change that state and our body is always trying to compensate to recover back to a nice homeostasis of balanced excitation and inhibition.